Pastor Brian Wolmueller. On today's episode of Cross Defense, we start talking about the three estates. That's what's coming next. And then afterwards, I'll put the link below, but I talk with Pastor Sean Dunzer about how the Christian dies and how our readiness for death and our hope in the resurrection makes us impervious to the devil's attacks, both as individuals as well as congregations. You'll love that conversation. All right, stay tuned. Welcome to Cross Defense. How you doing? I'm your host, Pastor Brian Wolmueller, pastor of Hope Lutheran Church in Aurora, Colorado. Your host for the next hour here on KFUO, Cross Defense. Having curious Christian conversation, talking about the things that you're thinking about, the things that the Bible says, and trying to find the intersection of the Lord's wisdom and our everyday life. We want to talk today about a couple of different things. I'm gonna open up the show with a quick conversation about the three estates. This is so important, the three estates. In fact, sometimes I just want to write articles for every major newspaper, every major magazine, and the title of the article would be, "There are three estates." And then the article would say, "That's all." I mean, this is just such a huge idea that I think will make so many pieces of the puzzle of our lives fall together, fall into place. That's what we're going to talk about the first bit, and then we're going to have Pastor Sean Dunzer come on. He sent me a note. What he wants to talk about is how to have a Christian death, not just as an individual, but also as a congregation. How Christian congregations can die a Christian death. That'll be curious. So we'll have to see what he has to say. But first, the three estates. And by the way, I would encourage you, if you're interested in this, you could just search Three Estates and put my last name in there, Wolmueller, Wolfmueller, and a couple of things. In fact, a bunch of stuff will come up, some videos and some YouTube videos and some articles. And one of the best places to look for that is an article called "Thinking Like a Lutheran," a quotation drop post. It's on the website, wolfmueller.co, with just a ton of Luther quotes about the three estates. Well, first, what are the three estates and why are they important? The three estates are, number one, church, number two, family, and number three, the state or the city. And these are the three governments or the three organizations, the three institutions that the Lord has built in to human order, to human society. And they are established by God, and because they're established by God, they cannot be overthrown. But that's maybe jumping ahead of ourselves. But let me tell you why they're important. Now, I don't know. I would love to hear from you guys if this is the same for you as it is for me. If this experience that I'm going to tell you about, if you share this. But it seems to me like my whole life, I mean, all through. As soon as I started thinking reflectively about things. So when did that start? Like 20 minutes ago, maybe. But I mean, back in high school and back in college, I always felt uncomfortable in the world. Like there was just stuff that didn't make sense. I'd never ever felt settled. Even if I didn't. It's not like we moved around a lot. We moved once when I was growing up, from Albuquerque to New Mexico, or from Texas to New Mexico. There in Albuquerque, but we moved houses a couple of times. So it wasn't an unsettled feeling like being unsettled in a place, but it's more like an unsettled feeling of the mind or an unsettled feeling of the conscience. I was reading and studying the stuff I was supposed to read and I was supposed to study going to school. All the literature stuff and all the science stuff, and I was learning all those sorts of things. I was going to church and I was learning the Bible studies at church, but it always felt like there was something unsettled. And I had a hard time putting my finger on it, but it seemed to me like I remember one time we went to a amusement park. Our youth group actually went to this amusement park, and we were there all day. So it closed at like midnight, and basically everyone left at like 9:30. So we spent from 9:30 until midnight just going over and over on this roller coaster that had like 3 loops on it, and there was no line. So every once in a while you could get this can happen, and we must have gone on this loop-de-loop roller coaster a dozen times, 15, 20 times. And I remember that whole night I felt like I was going on loop-de-loops. That just kind of, your equilibrium is off. Or I remember another time that we were out on a boat. We went out to do some snorkeling, and we were out on it was pretty choppy going out, and then we were on the boat all day, and then we came back into the shore, and you got your sea legs, so finally you got used to the boat, and then you hit the shore, and it feels like the ground is moving on the shore. Back and forth. It's like, and it seems to me like that's how I was in my own mind. Like my mind was floating around, unanchored, untethered, just out in the ocean, tossed to and fro. And I think the reason now, looking back on it, why when I was growing up, why I had this sensation of never being tethered or grounded is because I did not know. I was probably taught, but I just didn't know. I did not know the three estates. I did not have any sense that God had, in fact, established some orders in the world, some shape of the way that the world is, and that God had put it in place so that it can't be moved, so that that they just stay firm. And everything then, in my own mind and my own thinking, everything was movement. In fact, I think it's one of the bad offsprings of evolutionary thinking, is that everything is in flux. Nothing is sure. Everything is changing. We're just part of a big movement, one way or another. You hear this all the time where people talk about being on the wrong side of history, as if everything is changing, and it's just not true. Now, that's one of the great, comforting, hopeful messages about the three estates, is that not everything is changing. In fact, there's three things that will not change until the last day, and that is that there's a family, and there's a church, and there's a state. There's a human organization. There's a human governance. There's a city, as Luther calls it. Now, rage as he will, the devil cannot overthrow these three estates. Now, just think about that on the last day, there will be Christians. On the last day, there will be human families. On the last day, there will be some sort of human government, that the devil will rage against them, but those three things will stand because they are established by God. So let's talk about them in turn and say a few brief words about the three different estates. The first, and we want to talk about maybe a couple of things. We want to talk about one, where they come from. In other words, when were they instituted? Number two, why they were instituted. And number three, how we live in them. Let me give you a little bit of a historical introduction to this, if we could. The three estates, if you just go to Google and you Google three estates, you'll find a bunch of stuff about the French Revolution, because the people like to note that before the French Revolution, the society was governed like it was in the Middle Ages, and it had the three estates of those who pray, those who fight, and those who work. Those who pray, that's the monks and the priests. Those who fight, that's the kings and the soldiers. Those who work, that's the peasants. And civilization was divided up into those three estates, and that's probably about how it was at the time of Martin Luther in Germany. Those who pray, those who fight, those who work. And one of the things that the Catholic Church has done is say, if you want to be part of the holy estate, those who pray, you have to leave all of the other states aside. You can't be part of the family or part of the state. You can't be part of commerce and working if you're going to be a monk. In fact, that's what the vows to become a monk were. You took a vow of poverty, so you're not part of those who work, and you take a vow of chastity, so you're not part of the family. One of the most genius, I think perhaps often overlooked, but genius parts of Luther's theology is he was able to recognize that each person, you weren't in just one of the three estates, but in fact every single person was in all three estates. That the estates weren't just about our work or our vocations, but the estates are something much bigger than that. They're established by God. So every single one of us is in a family. Every single one of us ought to be in the church. And every single one of us is in a state or a city. We are neighbors to one another. And so we live in all three of these estates, and all three of these estates ask different things of us. Now, what they ask of us has to do with why God invented them, and we want to rejoice in the fact that two estates, maybe three, but at least two estates were created by God in the garden before the fall into sin. The estate of the family, when God put Adam to sleep, and he pulled a rib out of his side, and he fashioned the rib into Eve, and he brought Eve to Adam and said, look here. And Adam said, whoa, man. So you get that joke, woman? Anyhow, and they were married. The two shall become one flesh. a man shall leave his father and his mother, be joined to his wife. Adam had to say, when God said that, Adam had to say, what's a father and a mother? Which shows that marriage and parenthood are bound up together. In God's ordering of things, to be a husband is to be a father, and to be a wife is to be a mother, even if children haven't come yet, or maybe they never will. They are the same office. And that's the institution of family instituted by God in the garden. It's one of the most beautiful parts of the marriage liturgy. So when the pastor there is, after he pronounces them husband and wife, and the pastor's there blessing them, and he says, may God give you the blessing of Adam and Eve in the garden. Oh, that's just fantastic. So that's the institution of the family. The institution of the church also happened in the garden, and it happened when God planted the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and he said, don't eat from it. Now, this is maybe a little bit more to get into here, but very briefly, God always wants to be worshiped by faith, and if we're worshiping God by faith, then we have to be believing something that we can't see. That's why now we believe the resurrection and the forgiveness of sins. We can't see it, but we believe it. That's how we worship God by faith. Now, God can't promise life and forgiveness to Adam and Eve because there's no death and there's no sin. So in fact, the promise in the garden has to be a promise of what they can't see, death. If you, on the day that you eat of it, dying you will die, God says to Adam, and Adam preaches to Eve, so that Adam and Eve are supposed to go to that tree of the knowledge of garden, of the knowledge of good and evil, and they're supposed to worship the Lord by faith there, by believing the threat, the promise of death, and not eating. So there God has established the church. Now, the church looks different on the other side of the fall, just like the family looks different on the other side of the fall. They have different purposes, but the purpose of the family, the human family, is to bring forth and support physical life. The purpose of the church family, of the institution of the church, is to bring forth and support eternal life. And then there's the third estate, which is the state, the city, the government, the stuff we're hearing about constantly because it's this election cycle. And the state, and this is maybe an important thing to note, the state now is the last of the instituted estates, and it is the least important, at least in God's eyes. And if you're watching the news or you're reading the newspaper, it seems to us like the state is the most important, and I think there's a bit of like a Napoleon complex with the state. It likes to think that it is much more important than it actually is, but it's not. In fact, if things are going good at church and good at home, then the way things go in the state matter much, much less than these other two estates. And the estate of the government, the estate of the state, was established by God after the fall into sin, at least in the form that we know it now, established after the fall into the sin. Its authority is the sword, which is the authority to bring death. So that while the family is there to give earthly life and the church is there to give eternal life, the state is there to give death in the smallest possible portion. So that the goal or the purpose of the state is to destroy those who would destroy others. This is why the chief thing for the estate is the police and the army. That's the sword pointed in and the sword pointed out. It's to keep order so that people can live. The state, and it's good for us to remember that the state can't give life. It can only stop the people who want to take life. That's at least what it should do. That's why it was instituted by God. That's why he's given the sword to be wielded among men, so that the Lord can bring about little deaths to prevent bigger deaths. Now, what's an example of that is waging war, for example. When you go to war, you're pulling the sword of the state out of the sheath, and you're bringing violence to another nation because that nation wants to bring even more violence and death to you. So you bring a little bit of death to prevent the bigger death. Or say there's some criminal who's assaulting life, or he's assaulting property, he's assaulting chastity or whatever. So you bring the sword to bear, you take him to court, you put him in jail, so that you give him a little death to prevent the bigger death that he wants to cause. See, that's the goal of the state. We should just keep it in mind as we're voting. And by the way, the Christian always votes with the 10 Commandments in their mind. How can I love my neighbor by this vote? How can I support the institutions that God has established by the 10 Commandments? We should always keep this in mind, that the state can only bring forth a little bit of death. That's why we always, in some ways, want to limit the role of the government, because we know that the bigger the government, the bigger the death, in one way or another. So we have the three estates. God's ordering of the world. Now, we know this, and here's a couple of applications to kind of wrap this thing up. We know that the devil always attacks the works of God. So the devil's always attacking all three estates. We see him attacking the church by false doctrine and whatever. We see him attacking the family by trying to tear family apart, redefine family, putting husband and wife, setting them against each other and all this sort of stuff. And we see him attacking the state, trying to put tyrants in office and all this sort of stuff so that the state doesn't do its job, but, whatever. But we know, and this is the great thing to consider, we know that these estates established by God can't be overthrown. They will stand because they are instituted by God. I mean, marriage will stand. It doesn't matter if the state wants to redefine marriage. At the end of the world, when Jesus comes back, there will be marriage. Now, a lot of people might be destroyed in the devil's banging his head against the walls of the state, the church, and the family. But we rejoice to be in them and to be safe. In fact, and we can finish with this idea, Luther says that these three estates are like three walls that protect our conscience. And when we stand and we know our place in the church and the family and the state, then we stand with our feet on solid ground. We come off the roller coaster of the movements and the idea that things are always changing, and we stand on the solid ground of those things that the Lord has instituted. So maybe you can join me, first to read some of these Luther quotes on the three estates, but then join me in standing around in the midst of all of these conversations and saying to the people around you, hey, there's three estates, and God has established them, and he's put you in them so that you know your place, and you can rejoice that the Lord uses your family to give life, your church to give life eternal, and the state to save life. God be praised for these estates. You're listening to Cross Defense. I'm your host, Pastor Brian Wolmueller. We're going to go to the break and come right back with Pastor Sean Denzer, like 17 churches in North Dakota, I can never remember. And he's going to talk to us about dying a Christian death as individuals and maybe even as churches as well. I'm going to get his thoughts on the three estates when we get back, so stay tuned. We'll be right back. Like Pavlov's dog, when that music comes on, I start hosting the show. I'm your host, Pastor Brian. You're listening to Cross Defense on KFUO, Monday afternoon. Pastor Brian Wolmueller, pastor of Hope Lutheran Church in Aurora, Colorado. Whenever you're hanging around Aurora, Colorado, drop in, say hi. It'll be good to see you. Sunday morning or whenever. Except for Monday, 1 to 2 o'clock Mountain Time, I'll be hosting the show. I'll be busy. I got Pastor Denzer on the line. Hey, Pastor Denzer, how are you?
Doing well. How are you?
Good. You got like 520 churches. How many? You got
I've got two that are mine, Great Bend in Trinity in Great Bend and Peace in Barney in the southeast corner. I'm also circuit visitor and filling in vacancy at Emmanuel Hankinson and St. John in Belford. So, we're busy.
Why not have 4 churches?
No, why not?
I remember one time Father Angel, he's a priest down the street. He was ordained just a couple of weeks before me, and he said, Brian, I don't know how you do it, being married and having a church. It's like having 2 wives. And I said, no, Father Angel, it's more like having 250 extra children is what which he always funny. Hey, I was talking about the 3 estates. Did you hear any of that stuff?
I did. I was listening. It was great.
What do you think about...
Thanks for mentioning the French Revolution, too. I think that... I never realized that because I grew up in the sheltered Lutheran way of talking about it, but it's much more known there, and it overshadows it, and everyone's like, well, obviously that failed, so forget about that idea, right?
I do think this is one of the genius of Luther's thoughts. That he was able... we always talk about... When we talk about Luther's political thought, we talk about the 2 kingdoms. Right
yeah,
hand,
you
left
can't
hand.
have that without these 3 estates. I think you're right.
Yeah, fill in the blanks. What else do you think is important about these 3 estates?
I don't know. I think your summary is very good, and the insight that really, especially today, all of us live in all 3 of these realms. If you're a voter, you're part of the ruling estate. And all of us have households and part of the economy, and hopefully we're all Christians as well. Yeah. We got to be careful. I see this trying to push the pastors back into their own estate sometimes on the part of the laity, particularly when it comes to prayers. I don't know about you, but in my churches, they almost can't start the funeral luncheon until the pastor gets back because you got to start with the table prayer, and nobody can pray but the pastor. And the funny thing about that is that's not really true at all. In fact, prayer is the thing that is the proper function and proper activity of all Christians. In the New Testament, all Christians are priests. What do priests do? They offer sacrifices and they pray. The sacrifices are our bodies, our lives. We're living sacrifices, as Romans 12 says, and prayer, right? Everything is sanctified by the word of God and prayer. So yes, if the pastor lead the prayer in the same way that the father usually leads the prayer at the table, but when the father's not there, oldest son takes over, maybe mom takes over. All Christians do this part. So, yeah, you can't leave that to the pastor to do.
It's a common thing where, especially in conservative thought, that every man's home is his castle, which I think is really quite beautiful. But the three estates teach us also that every home is a chapel. And I think, how about this idea? We know that Luther left the monastery, so he left the Augustinian monastery. And what it means to be a monk is you have poverty, chastity, and obedience. So poverty, you can't own anything. Chastity, you can't get married. Obedience means that you're obedient to the order. So every monastic community had an order of prayer. You got to pray these psalms in this order. You got to have these 7 times of prayer, and that's the obedience. Well, when Luther writes the Catechism, this is the assertion I want you to challenge me on. When Luther writes the Catechism, he's really writing a rule or an order for the home. So there's morning prayer, there's evening prayer, there's meal prayers, and Luther's saying, hey, you're not going to go and seclude yourself from the family by becoming a monk. You're going to live in the home, but the home is also a monastery or a chapel. The home is also a place of prayer. So everyone in the family is also participating in this.
Absolutely, he is. Even talks about that in the Table of Duties, right? He even says these are the holy orders, and it's not monks, it's not Benedictines and Augustinians. It's right, father and mother, ruler, citizen, preacher, hearer, slave, worker, right? All these things.
Fantastic.
Yeah, no, you're right. And Luther did a wonderful thing in almost returning a taste of the daily offices back to the congregation, which, in my understanding, in terms of history and development, I think they began in the cathedrals. They began in the churches for everyone, and only later kind of turned into these monks do this in our place.
Yeah. So like Matins and Vespers and all these other Compline and all these other orders, they would have belonged to the congregation, and now the monks say, no, these belong to us. And Luther says, no, they belong to everybody. There's something about that in the Reformation, too, with the Lord's Supper, because the priest had said, hey, the blood, that belongs to us. They had considered the priesthood to be those who pray. That's who the church was, and everyone else was distinct. And the Reformation says, no, all these things belong to all of us. They're common to the church, the body and the blood. The office of prayer and hearing the Lord's word. If you have it sort of trapped in Latin, then the hearing of the word belongs only to those who are trained in it. But the Lutherans had to say, no, the hearing of the Lord's word belongs to all the Lord's people.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, you want to talk about dying like a Christian as a Christian congregation, right?
That's kind of.
Hey, thanks for listening to Cross Defense. You can subscribe to the YouTube channel, and you can get all the videos that we're doing, but you can also go and subscribe to the podcast for Cross Defense. If you follow the link below to the archives, you can find that as well and listen to the show every week. Thanks for your support.